palace was quiet, until a young prince cried out. Prince George, curious about the grandmother he never met, opened a memory box that changed everything. Inside, a photo and a secret. As he stared into Princess Diana's smiling eyes, the truth of her tragic death hit him like a storm. The car crash, the cameras, the silence. It was all too real. His tears weren't just for her, but for the unanswered questions still haunting the crown. This wasn't just grief. It was a spark, one that could reignite everything the monarchy tried to bury. The moment the truth hit, sunlight streamed through the windows of Kensington Palace, but it couldn't soften the moment. Prince George, now old enough to sense more than royal pomp, held a dust-covered memory box. It had been locked away for years. Inside, beneath the velvet lining, lay a single photo. Princess Diana, smiling warmly, holding young Prince William. Behind it, a handwritten note. For George, remember who she was. George froze. He'd heard her name before, but this felt different. He ran down the hallway, clutching the image, and found Kate. She took one look and whispered, "She loved like no one else. She was brave, kind, your grandmother." The palace's grandeur faded around him. He sat, trembling, overwhelmed. This woman wasn't just a story. She had lived. She had loved. And now she was gone. Forever. Tears rolled down his cheeks. It wasn't just sadness. It was the crushing weight of something lost before it was ever known. He looked again at her face. Her eyes almost glimmered, as if they still held something unsaid. That photo had unlocked something. The box wasn't just a keepsake. It was a bridge between past and present. His tears echoed down the halls, carrying a truth he'd never expected to find. In that moment, nothing would ever be the same again. George's deep bond with Diana. Even without meeting her, George felt Diana's presence. Since childhood, he had heard stories, how she danced barefoot, made strangers feel seen, and defied tradition with kindness. People said George had her smile, her eyes, even her spirit. Those stories were background noise until the photo made it real. "She's inside me," he whispered. It wasn't just that he resembled her. It was a connection he could feel. Her legacy wasn't just royal, it was personal. He began asking questions, at first about simple things, her favorite music, her laugh. But soon, why she left, what she stood for. The answers stirred something in him. She had fought for the voiceless, challenged the rules. He felt proud, and he missed her, deeply, painfully. "Would she have seen me now?" he asked one night. William nodded. "She'd be proud." That answer struck hard. Grief for a woman he never knew, yet felt bound to. Suddenly, Diana wasn't history. She was family, and George felt like her story now ran in his blood. The crash, what he learned. After learning who Diana was, George needed to know how she died. Whispers, headlines, fragments of truth. Until William sat him down and said the words, "There was a car crash, a tunnel in Paris, paparazzi, a drunk driver, no seatbelt, Diana gone." George stared at the floor. It didn't make sense. Why didn't someone save her? He asked. William struggled to answer. The more George heard, the worse it got. The photos, the chase, the chaos. She wasn't just lost. She was chased to her death. A princess, crushed by the very fame that once lifted her. "Did she know?" George asked. William explained how she feared the cameras, the pressure, but she faced it all, determined to live on her own terms. And in the end, that bravery cost her everything. From that day, George saw fame differently. It wasn't just attention. It could be a threat. The photograph now felt heavier. It was no longer just a memory. It was a warning. His future, once full of promise, now carried something darker. The knowledge that royalty doesn't always protect you. Sometimes, it breaks you. Truth, myths, and conspiracies. Soon, Prince George discovered that the world doesn't offer just one story, it offers many. The official version described a tragic accident, a drunk driver losing control in a tunnel. A terrible mistake, officials called it, but online, darker whispers grew louder. Forums and rumor sites suggested conspiracy, that Diana had been silenced, that powerful forces wanted her kept quiet, that it wasn't chance, it was planning. For a young royal, this was a shock. If the monarchy stood for truth, why would people whisper these things? Was it really all so simple? He asked Kate one evening. Her silence spoke volumes. Later, his father admitted the truth might be layered, some questions never fully answered. That answer felt hollow and terrifying. These shadows in the story made Diana's death feel more like a puzzle than history. George dove deeper, reading archived interviews, scouring headlines, trying to sort facts from speculation. He saw how facts blurred when emotion and politics mingled. People still demanded answers years later. That persistence puzzled and moved him. If half the world believed there was a hidden truth, could the palace ever deliver closure? Could they be trusted? Those doubts rattled him. He felt torn between family loyalty and moral responsibility. Finding the truth felt like honoring his grandmother's memory. Yet questioning too hard felt like betraying the crown. The weight of that balance began to shape his thoughts. History isn't simple. It's messy, conflicting, built on both noise and silence. And George was learning that sometimes the loudest stories are the ones that hide the most. The power of public belief. After diving into these conflicting tales, George saw something extraordinary. Princess Diana's story still moved the world. Even now, blogs posted new conspiracy theories, fans created videos calling for justice. Crowds gathered to leave flowers. People remembered her not just fondly, but fervently, as though she'd been taken too soon and too unfairly. That powerful emotional charge both comforted and scared him. He realized her legacy wasn't confined to palace walls. It lived on in the hearts of strangers. That was beautiful. But it also meant people might expect him to continue her mission, to answer for her loss. And what if he couldn't? He whispered to William, "They still ask for her truth. What if they ask for mine?" His father paused, knowing George had begun the journey from boy to symbolic figure. The public hadn't just mourned Diana. They'd championed her. They accused. They demanded. They remembered. That fire was still alive. George felt both pride and fear. He saw how emotion could outlast decades, how stories could define nations. And suddenly, being a royal wasn't just about tradition. It was about navigating a world that still felt too much, that still feared what fame could cost. His grandmother's tragedy had grown into a movement, and he was suddenly the potential heir to both the crown and the expectation. The weight of her memory now rested on his young shoulders. But with that weight, he also discovered a sense of purpose. Not just inheriting a title, but inheriting the responsibility to keep truth alive. no matter how messy it might be. George's painful questions. After the tears dried and the facts settled, Prince George found himself full of questions. Questions that weren't easy to ask and even harder to answer. The quiet halls of the palace echoed with thoughts he couldn't shake. The more he learned about Princess Diana, the deeper the ache grew. This wasn't just grief. It was confusion, anger, and longing all tangled together. He turned to his parents in a soft voice one night and asked, "Did the royal family love her?" It was the kind of question that makes time stop. William and Kate exchanged a glance. William, whose own memories were still haunted by that day in 1997, tried to speak with strength, but his voice wavered. "Yes, George, but sometimes love doesn't win against everything else." That answer didn't comfort him. It opened 1,000 more doors in his mind. Why didn't they protect her? Why wasn't she still alive? Why didn't anyone stop what was happening? The next day he asked, "Why didn't Grandpa stop it?" Meaning Charles. Again, no one had a perfect answer. These weren't just innocent questions. These were the kinds of questions that had been buried in silence for decades. But now, they were rising again, this time through the voice of a child. And then came the quietest, most heartbreaking one of all. Did she know I'd exist one day? Kate's breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside her son and held his hand. I think she hoped. She wanted a better world for the next generation. For you. That answer stayed with George for days. He began reading old headlines, watching footage of Diana walking through minefields, hugging AIDS patients, defying everything the monarchy had stood for at the time. He started to understand why her name still stirred emotions across the world. She was more than a princess. She was a symbol. But that understanding didn't come without pain. Every question led to another. Every answer left behind a piece of something missing. He wasn't just grieving the loss of a grandmother, he was uncovering a legacy that had been clouded by silence and politics. And now, that silence was cracking. What started as a discovery had turned into a storm inside George's heart. And it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about who he was becoming. The public reacts to George's tears. As soon as whispers of Prince George's emotional moment began to spread, the world took notice. What started as a quiet family moment quickly turned into a media storm. Online forums lit up. Social media erupted. News outlets began publishing headlines like, "Diana's legacy lives through George," and "Young prince in tears over grandmother he never met." People weren't just reacting, they were grieving all over again. For many, Diana was the first royal who felt real. She had touched lives far beyond palace gates. And now, seeing her grandson openly cry for her, it was like opening an old wound the world never quite healed. Across platforms, support poured in. Fans wrote letters, painted portraits, even created digital tributes, blending images of Diana and George side by side, as if time had stitched them together. Comment sections overflowed with love and heartbreak. He's her echo. History is repeating itself. Protect him. These weren't just comments. They were pleas. Inside the palace, things shifted. Advisors scrambled to control the narrative. They hadn't expected George's grief to go public. But now, the monarchy faced a mirror, and the reflection was raw, vulnerable, human. William and Kate, while protective, understood the gravity of the moment. William remembered what it felt like to mourn in the public eye. He didn't want that pain for his son. But they also saw something powerful happening. George had connected people to Diana again, not through status, but through shared emotion. For the first time in years, the public wasn't talking about politics or royal protocol. They were talking about grief, family, and truth. George had become a symbol, not because of his title, but because of his tears. In the days that followed, the palace received thousands of messages from across the globe. Some offered comfort. Others begged the family to speak openly about Diana at last. There were calls for documentaries, interviews, even new investigations. George, without even knowing it, had reopened the world's love story with a woman gone too soon. And just like that, a boy's heartbreak had become a moment the monarchy couldn't ignore. Diana's history comes alive. Following the wave of emotion stirred by George's tears, something powerful happened. Princess Diana's story came roaring back to life. Her 1995 Panorama interview resurfaced, shared millions of times online. People listened again to her words. There were three of us in this marriage: the raw honesty, the vulnerability. It all felt painfully relevant. George, curious and overwhelmed, asked to watch it. William hesitated, but eventually agreed. And there it was. His grandmother, speaking not as a royal, but as a woman who had been silenced, misunderstood, and broken. George watched silently. No blinking, no questions, just a stillness that made the room feel frozen. Later, he opened books on Diana's charity work, landmine campaigns, hospital visits, AIDS activism. It amazed him. She hadn't just existed within palace walls, she had stepped far beyond them, into danger, into heartbreak, into history. She was fearless, he whispered to himself, flipping through images of Diana holding sick children in war-torn countries. The realization settled deep. This wasn't just a grandmother. This was a global force of change. And somehow, that spirit had passed to him. At school, he asked his teachers if they could discuss her work. One teacher choked up. Another brought in newspaper clippings from the 90s. Soon, his classmates were watching documentaries. Diana was no longer a ghost. She was a living, breathing story. George started keeping a notebook. In it, he wrote down quotes from Diana, notes about her causes, questions he still had. It became a personal project, a mission, because the more he learned, the more he felt a responsibility, not just to remember her, but to continue what she started. In the span of weeks, Diana had gone from being a photograph in a dusty box to the compass guiding George's heart. He now saw himself not just as a prince, but as a bridge between generations. And Diana's history wasn't just alive. It was waking something powerful inside her grandson. The emotional conflict in the palace. The world's response to George's tears created a ripple that couldn't be ignored. And inside the palace, it triggered a deep emotional storm. Suddenly, old grief wasn't just resurfacing in public. It was exploding behind closed doors. At the center of it all stood King Charles, a man haunted by history and now forced to face it again through the eyes of his grandson. When Charles heard what had happened, the memory box, the photograph, the tears, he reportedly went quiet for hours. Staff noticed the change. Meetings were delayed. Tensions rose. This wasn't just about an emotional child. It was about the shadow that Diana had cast over the monarchy, a shadow that never really left. William, who had been trying for years to protect his family from the media circus that consumed his mother, felt caught in the middle. He remembered his own boyhood pain, walking behind Diana's coffin, being told to stay strong while the world wept. Now he saw his own son cracking under the same weight, and he feared history was repeating itself. Camilla, meanwhile, stayed silent. She had long accepted her role in Diana's story and knew she would never escape it. She understood that to George, no matter how much kindness she showed, she would never be his grandmother. And in this moment, her silence said everything. Palace advisors scrambled. Some pushed for damage control. Others feared the growing public support for George's emotional moment would reignite calls for the crown to finally address Diana's death more directly. But addressing it meant digging up painful truths and perhaps opening wounds they'd worked decades to seal. There were emergency talks, quiet family meetings, and behind-the-scenes media strategy sessions. The crown had survived many storms, but few as emotionally raw as this. Because this wasn't scandal. It wasn't betrayal. It was heartbreak. A boy crying for a woman he never met, and the world crying with him. And as the palace scrambled to protect its image, one thing became clear. This wasn't just about Diana anymore. It was about the cost of silence. The cost of pretending everything was fine when, behind the gates, the pain had never really faded. How this could change, George. George didn't return to normal after that day. Something inside him had shifted. He no longer walked the palace corridors with wide-eyed innocence. There was a new weight in his steps, a maturity that only grief can bring. He wasn't just processing the past. He was beginning to think about the future, his future. At first, he grew quieter. He stayed up late, reading about Diana's life, her causes, her fights. He watched footage of her confronting world leaders and walking through dangerous war zones without flinching. He began to admire her not just as family, but as a kind of blueprint. She hadn't just been royal, she had been real. And that distinction struck something deep. He started asking bigger questions about the press, about ethics, about justice. Kate noticed he had become more observant, less focused on appearances, more interested in truth. And William saw shades of Diana in every new word George spoke. One evening, George sat quietly at the dinner table and said something no one expected. "I want to do something in her name. One day." It wasn't just a dream. It was a decision. The boy who had once been shielded from royal drama was now ready to step toward it, with purpose. George began sketching ideas for foundations. He talked about mental health, children's hospitals, anti-bullying campaigns. He asked if the palace archives had letters Diana had written. He wanted to know what she had hoped for, what she believed in. This wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of an identity forming. Diana's blood ran in his veins, but now her values were shaping his thoughts. And though he remained young, everyone around him noticed a quiet resolve forming. He was still playful, still kind, but beneath that warmth now burned something sharper: awareness, empathy, direction. George wasn't just becoming a future king, he was becoming a voice. And if the monarchy paid attention, they'd realize that Diana's legacy wasn't resting in history books anymore. It was alive, in George. And it was only getting stronger. Royal secrecy and its cost. The British monarchy has always survived by keeping its pain behind polished doors. Grief is acknowledged, but rarely discussed. Mistakes are buried beneath titles, and scandals are washed clean by time and protocol. But George's emotional awakening exposed something the royals had long feared: What happens when the silence no longer works? From Diana to Meghan, emotional truths have always been the monarchy's greatest threat. Not because they break laws, but because they break the illusion of perfection. George, without intending to, cracked that illusion wide open. And now the question echoed through every palace room. How much longer can the crown survive without facing its ghosts? For decades, the royals operated under a simple rule: never complain, never explain. But that strategy couldn't hold against raw emotion. George didn't give an interview, he didn't write a memoir, he simply cried, and it was more powerful than 1,000 headlines. Inside the palace, there were urgent conversations. Some urged transparency, others warned against it. But one thing was clear: the people no longer wanted perfection. They wanted truth. They wanted emotion. And George had given them that. The cost of secrecy was showing. Public trust wavered. Younger generations were asking, why does no one ever say sorry? Why is no one allowed to cry? These weren't just public relations concerns. These were existential questions. Questions the palace couldn't answer with rehearsed speeches. George, still young, had no idea how deeply he'd shaken the system. But every tear he shed was a challenge to the old way. He wasn't just his grandmother's echo. He was her revenge on the silence that tried to erase her. And now, the monarchy stood at a crossroads. Bury the emotion again, or finally step into the truth. Because the cost of silence was no longer just about bad press. It was about losing the soul of the crown. The People's Prince. They started calling him Diana's Echo, not because he looked like her, though he did, not even because he cried like she once had, but because something about George reminded people of hope, of the royal family they wanted, not the one they'd come to expect. On social media, fans created art. George's face beside Diana's, the words "The legacy continues" scrawled underneath. Hashtags trended. Old photos of Diana holding William were edited to show George beside her, as if time had folded over to make space for healing. Petitions appeared online. People demanded a new memorial in Diana's name, this time designed by George himself. Documentaries began production, centered on how Diana's spirit now lived on in her grandson. Fan edits went viral. TikToks, tributes, timelines, all leading back to one image. A boy holding a photo, crying in a palace hallway. George had become more than a royal. He was a mirror of public grief, a bridge between royalty and reality. People weren't just watching his journey, they were investing in it, hoping he'd turn out different. That maybe, just maybe, the next generation would break the cycle. Inside the palace, it didn't go unnoticed. Aides began briefing senior royals on George's growing popularity. Commentators predicted he would become the emotional center of the monarchy. And for once, the crown wasn't being held up by protocol. It was being lifted by compassion. George didn't set out to be a symbol. He just wanted to know his grandmother. But in doing so, he reminded the world that royals are human, that grief doesn't care about bloodlines, that sometimes a single tear can do what decades of tradition could not: connect. He wasn't just the heir, he was the heart, and now all eyes were on what he'd do next. What happens next? The question now sits heavy in the air. What happens next? Does the palace address the surge of public emotion? Will they finally revisit the tragedy that's haunted them for decades? Or will they try once again to move on like nothing happened? There are whispers inside royal circles about a possible new tribute, A Diana Foundation reboot, this time with George involved. There's talk of George giving a public speech, or even appearing in a special documentary about his grandmother. But nothing is confirmed, and that silence only fuels more questions. People are watching, waiting. Will George be allowed to speak? Will the crown give him room to honor the woman who shaped him from beyond the grave? Or will they try to bury it again? Hide the pain, lock the truth back in the box it came from. No one knows for sure. But one thing is clear. This moment has changed something. The people saw a future king cry, and they cried with him. The palace felt that. The world felt that. Now, for the first time in years, it feels like change isn't just possible. It feels inevitable. And one question remains, beating louder with every passing day. Can the truth finally bring peace to the crown? George's tears have awakened more than just family memories. They've shaken the very core of royal silence. As the world watches, one thing is clear. Diana's story isn't over, and her grandson may be the one who finally demands the truth that history has long been denied.